What if your kids just stopped speaking one day and stayed silent for 8 months? In a $40 million Malibu mansion, 6-year-old twins Emma and Ethan went from being inseparable to complete strangers overnight. 8 therapists, 0 progress. No one could reach them until one woman walked through their front door. The truth no expert tells you. Not every wound needs medicine. This woman wasn't a psychologist. She was a former preschool teacher with no fancy degrees, but with a gift no one else had. She saw the children no one else could reach. In this video, you'll witness how she used just 3 threads and a story to rebuild a broken bond, why emotional presence, not therapy, became the turning point, and the moment 2 silent children finally whispered each other's names again. Emma and Ethan watched their nanny die in a fire. Since that night, they hadn't said a word, until the day she sat them down and taught them to make friendship bracelets. If you skip this, you might miss the simplest way to help a hurting child. Not with diagnoses or medication, but with presence, patience, and a little bit of string. The Morrison estate in Malibu had always been a paradise for children. The sprawling compound featured 2 swimming pools, a private playground that rivaled Disneyland, and enough space for 6-year-old twins Emma and Ethan to run wild under the California sun. But for the past 8 months, the only sounds echoing through the mansion were the desperate footsteps of their father David Morrison, pacing the marble halls in helpless frustration. Emma and Ethan Morrison had been the light of their family, a perfect pair of golden-haired tornadoes who chattered constantly in their own twin language, finished each other's sentences, and approached every day like it was their personal adventure. Emma, older by 12 minutes, was the planner who organized elaborate games of pretend. Ethan was the daredevil who would climb any tree jump off any surface and somehow convince his more cautious sister to join him. They had been inseparable since birth, sleeping in the same crib, despite having their own nurseries, wearing matching outfits by choice rather than parental decision, and creating an elaborate fantasy world that only they could fully understand. Then came the night that shattered everything. Mrs. Henderson, their beloved nanny, who had cared for them since they were babies, had been putting them to bed when an electrical fire broke out in the East Wing. While trying to evacuate the children, she'd gone back for Emma's favorite stuffed elephant and never made it out. The twins had watched from the safety of the garden as flames consumed the wing, where Mrs. Henderson had vanished, screaming her name until their voices gave out. They hadn't spoken since. David Morrison, CEO of Morrison Tech and one of Silicon Valley's most successful entrepreneurs, found himself completely powerless in the face of his children's trauma. The man who could command boardrooms filled with industry titans who had built a billion-dollar empire from a college dorm room idea couldn't coax a single word from his own children. The twins had retreated into a silence so complete it seemed to swallow everything around them. Emma spent her days curled in window seats, staring at nothing, while Ethan had developed a disturbing habit of destroying his toys with methodical precision. They no longer played together, no longer seemed to even see each other, despite sharing the same space. David had tried everything money could buy. Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned specialist in childhood trauma and twin psychology, had been the first expert through their door. She'd spent weeks trying to understand the complex dynamics of twin grief, how their shared trauma had somehow severed the invisible connection that had defined their entire existence. Twins often develop their own language, their own world, she'd explained. When that world is shattered by trauma, they can lose not only their voice, but their sense of identity as individuals. Dr. Chen's approach involved separate therapy sessions trying to help each child process their grief independently. After 2 months with no progress, she recommended Dr. Michael Torres, who specialized in play therapy for traumatized children. Dr. Torres had arrived with boxes of therapeutic toys, sand trays for expression, and dollhouses designed to help children work through difficult emotions. Emma had stared at the materials with empty eyes. Ethan had systematically broken every single toy truck, his face blank as he crushed plastic wheels under his heel. Dr. Rebecca Foster tried art therapy. The twins produced nothing but scribbled black marks on paper. Dr. James Liu attempted music therapy, thinking sound might unlock what words couldn't. The children sat in absolute silence while he played guitar, sang songs, and tried every technique in his considerable arsenal. Dr. Patricia Weston specialized in EMDR therapy for children. Dr. Alex Rodriguez was an expert in selective mutism. Dr. Jennifer Park had written papers on twin attachment disorders. Dr. Maria Santos understood the neurological impacts of witnessing trauma. 8 months, 8 different specialists, 8 different approaches that led nowhere. Each session cost thousands of dollars. Each failure drove David deeper into despair and guilt that consumed him like acid. He'd been traveling when the fire happened, closing a deal in Tokyo that had seemed critically important at the time. While he was celebrating a merger that would make him even richer, his children were watching. The only stable figure in their lives died trying to save a stuffed animal. The guilt was killing him. His company demanded constant attention, board meetings that couldn't be postponed, decisions that affected thousands of employees. But every moment spent at the office felt like another betrayal of Emma and Ethan, who needed him more than any business deal ever could. Standing in his home office one gray morning, surrounded by psychiatric reports and therapy recommendations, David made a desperate decision. The experts weren't working. Maybe what his children needed wasn't more therapy. Maybe they needed someone who could simply be present, who could offer the kind of steady, loving care that Mrs. Henderson had provided. He needed to hire a live-in caregiver, not another nanny who would try to replace Mrs. Henderson, but someone who could give Emma and Ethan the constant attention and patience they required while he figured out how to balance saving his family with saving his company. The agency sent him files on experienced professionals, women with degrees in child development, certifications in trauma care, impeccable references from wealthy families who required discretion and excellence. But it was the last application that caught David's attention. Keisha Williams, 32 years old, former preschool teacher with 8 years of experience before taking time off for personal reasons. Her references came from parents, other teachers, and child psychologists who described her as having an intuitive understanding of children's emotional needs. One letter stood out, written by Dr. Angela Thompson, a family therapist. Keisha has a rare gift for seeing children as complete individuals rather than problems to be solved. She understands that healing happens in relationship, not in isolation. I would trust her with any child, especially those who have been overlooked or misunderstood. David called her that afternoon. Keisha Williams arrived at the Morrison estate on a foggy Tuesday morning, carrying a worn leather bag that had seen her through 8 years of teaching preschool. She stood before the imposing gates, looking up at the sprawling mansion that could have housed 50 families, and whispered a quiet prayer for wisdom. The house was breathtaking and heartbreaking in equal measure. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that required an army of staff to maintain. But underneath the luxury, Keisha could feel the profound sadness that had settled into the walls like dust. Family photos lined the hallways, images of happier times when the twins' laughter had filled these same spaces. David Morrison met her in the foyer, his expensive suit unable to hide the exhaustion that had carved lines around his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months, which Keisha suspected was probably accurate. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I should prepare you. Emma and Ethan aren't like other children right now. They don't speak, they barely acknowledge each other's existence, and they certainly don't respond to new people. The previous caregivers found them challenging." Keisha nodded, her heart already aching for this broken family. She'd seen trauma's impact on children during her teaching years, but she'd also learned something that most experts missed. Children were remarkably resilient when they felt truly seen and understood. "Where are they now?" she asked gently. "Their rooms. Separate rooms now. They can't seem to tolerate being together anymore. Emma's upstairs East Wing, Ethan's in the West Wing playroom." The separation struck Keisha immediately. Twins who had been inseparable were now living like strangers in opposite ends of a mansion. Whatever had broken between them was at the heart of their silence. She found Emma first curled in a reading nook surrounded by untouched books. The little girl was ethereal pale as porcelain with golden hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. She wore an expensive pink dress that looked like it had never been wrinkled, sitting with perfect posture as she stared out at the gardens. Keisha didn't speak immediately. Instead, she settled into a chair across the nook, far enough away to avoid crowding, but close enough to be present. From her bag, she pulled out a simple wooden puzzle, not the electronic educational toys that probably filled Emma's room, but a basic jigsaw puzzle featuring a family of rabbits. "I used to have a little girl who loved puzzles," Keisha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She would spend hours putting pieces together, saying that finding where things belonged made her feel peaceful. Emma's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. She was listening. Keisha began working on the puzzle slowly, her movements calm and unhurried. This little girl, she had a twin brother who was her very best friend. They did everything together, built blanket forts, shared secrets, even had their own special way of talking that nobody else understood. For the first time in 8 months, Emma turned her head and looked directly at another person. Her blue eyes were filled with such profound sadness that Keisha had to blink back tears. "Sometimes," Keisha continued, placing another puzzle piece, "when people we love go away, it feels like part of us goes with them, like we don't know how to be ourselves anymore without them." Emma slid down from the reading nook and after a long moment of hesitation sat beside Keisha. She didn't touch the puzzle, but she watched intently as Keisha worked. Finding Ethan was like discovering a small tornado had been contained in one room. The West Wing playroom looked like a war zone, toys scattered and broken furniture, overturned books, torn and scattered across expensive Persian rugs. In the center of the chaos sat a little boy who looked exactly like his sister, but radiated an entirely different energy. Where Emma had retreated inward, Ethan had exploded outward. His golden hair was messy, his clothes rumpled, and his eyes held an anger that was frightening in someone so young. He was methodically tearing pages from a picture book, his movements precise and deliberate. Keisha sat down on the floor amid the destruction, not commenting on the mess or trying to stop his activity. From her bag, she pulled out a package of modeling clay, the kind that could be squeezed, pounded, and reshaped endlessly without breaking. "You know what I do when I feel like breaking things," she said conversationally, opening the clay and beginning to knead it with her hands. "I found something that can't break, no matter how hard I try." Ethan paused in his book-destroying watching as Keisha pounded the clay with more force than seemed necessary for such a gentle woman. Sometimes everything inside feels so big and angry that it has to come out somehow. She continued shaping the clay into a ball and then smashing it flat. But breaking things that can't be fixed just makes the angry feelings bigger. She held out a piece of clay to Ethan. After a long moment, he dropped the torn book and took it immediately, beginning to pummel it with tiny fists. Over the following weeks, Keisha established separate routines with each twin, while slowly, carefully trying to understand what had broken between them. Emma responded to quiet activities, puzzles, drawing, gentle conversations about feelings. Ethan needed physical outlets, clay work, building blocks he could knock down safely, activities that let him express his rage without causing damage. What struck Keisha most profoundly was how completely they ignored each other. When they occasionally ended up in the same room, they moved around each other like ghosts, never making eye contact, never acknowledging the other's presence. It was as if each child believed that recognizing their twin would somehow make Mrs. Henderson's death more real. Keisha had her own understanding of twin loss. 3 years earlier, she'd miscarried twins at 20 weeks. 2 babies she'd already named and dreamed about, whose loss had shattered her marriage and sent her into a depression so deep she'd had to leave teaching for 2 years. She understood the specific grief of losing someone who was supposed to be part of your soul. But she also understood something. The expensive therapists had missed Emma and Ethan weren't just grieving Mrs. Henderson. They were grieving each other. Somehow in their trauma, they'd lost the connection that had defined their entire existence. They needed to learn how to be twins again, before they could learn how to speak. David watched from doorways and around corners, amazed at the subtle changes in his children. They weren't speaking yet, but they were present in ways they hadn't been since the fire. Emma had started eating meals instead of just pushing food around her plate. Ethan had stopped destroying his toys, channeling his energy into clay sculptures that looked like abstract representations of his inner chaos. For the first time in 8 months, David began to hope that maybe possibly his family could heal. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon, while Keisha was in the garden, with Emma teaching her to plant seeds in small pots. David's mother, Margaret Morrison, had decided to visit unannounced, a woman who wielded her considerable influence like a weapon and had never approved of her son's parenting choices. Margaret arrived in a chauffeured Bentley, dressed in the kind of austere elegance that suggested she owned half of whatever city she happened to be visiting. She swept into the mansion like a winter storm, her cold eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. "David," she announced without preamble, "this situation has gone on long enough. Those children need proper institutional care, not whatever amateur therapy you're providing here." Keisha, who had been quietly helping Emma water her seedlings, felt the little girl shrink against her side. Even without words, Emma understood the threat this imposing woman represented. "Mother, please," David said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "The children are making progress. Keisha has been incredible with them." Margaret's gaze fell on Keisha with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for hired help. "I'm sure she's very nice, but these children have severe psychological damage. They need to be in a residential treatment facility where trained professionals can provide round-the-clock care." "They need to be home," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. 8 months of failure had worn down his confidence in his own judgment. "Look at them, David," Margaret continued ruthlessly. "Emma hasn't spoken in 8 months. Ethan destroys everything he touches. They can't even be in the same room together without having some sort of breakdown. This isn't a home. It's a beautiful prison where 2 damaged children are slowly deteriorating." Margaret had done her research. She'd already contacted Willowbrook Academy, an exclusive residential facility in Switzerland that specialized in difficult children from wealthy families. They have openings available immediately. The children could be there within the week, receiving proper care from people who actually understand childhood trauma. David felt the familiar weight of guilt crushing down on him. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe his desperate need to keep his family together was actually hurting Emma and Ethan. Maybe love wasn't enough to heal what had been broken. Keisha listened to this conversation with growing alarm, recognizing the moment when a grieving parent's exhaustion could lead to decisions that felt practical but were actually devastating. She'd seen it before: children who needed patience and connection being sent away because the adults in their lives couldn't tolerate the messiness of actual healing. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "could I try something with the children? Just one more approach before any decisions are made." Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "What could you possibly do that 8 months of trained professionals haven't already attempted?" Keisha didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked at David with steady eyes. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most powerful. Give me 1 hour with Emma and Ethan together. If it doesn't work, I'll support whatever decision you make." That evening, Keisha set up a small table in the living room, not the formal parlor where the family entertained guests, but the cozy space where the twins used to play before the fire. She arranged simple supplies, colorful embroidery floss, small beads, and scissors. She called Emma first, then Ethan, asking them to come sit at the table. For several minutes, they sat in their usual silence, carefully avoiding eye contact with each other while focusing intently on Keisha. "I want to teach you something," she said softly, beginning to braid 3 strands of floss together. "When I was your age, my grandmother taught me to make friendship bracelets. She said that when you make something with your hands for someone you care about, you put a little piece of your heart into it." She worked slowly, her movements deliberate and soothing. "The beautiful thing about friendship bracelets is that they're not perfect. See how some of the knots are tighter than others? How the pattern gets a little wonky here and there? That's what makes them special. They show that a real person made them with real hands and a real heart." Emma watched with growing fascination as a pattern emerged from the colored threads. Ethan, despite his determination to remain disinterested, found himself leaning closer to see the intricate braiding. The most important part, Keisha continued, is choosing who you want to make one for. It has to be someone who matters to you, someone you want to stay connected to, even when you're apart. She finished the bracelet and tied it around her own wrist. This one is for my little girl, who had to go to heaven before I got to meet her. When I wear it, I remember that love doesn't disappear just because someone isn't with us anymore. Keisha placed sets of floss in front of each child. Would you like to try making one? You don't have to give it to anyone if you don't want to. But sometimes making something beautiful helps us remember the good things instead of just the scary things. Emma was the first to reach for the threads, her small fingers tentative as she tried to copy Keisha's braiding pattern. Ethan watched his sister for a long moment, then picked up his own set of floss. For 20 minutes, they worked in concentrated silence. Emma's bracelet was neat and careful, her pattern precise, despite her small fingers. Ethan's was messier, more colorful, with knots that showed his impatience, but also his determination. When they finished, both children held their creations uncertainly, as if unsure what to do next. They're beautiful, Keisha said sincerely. Who do you think you'd like to give them to? Emma looked at her bracelet, then at her brother. For the first time in 8 months, she made direct eye contact with Ethan. In a voice so soft it was barely audible, she whispered, "For Ethan." Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his sister, then at his own messier bracelet. "For Emma," he whispered back. They reached across the table simultaneously, each tying their handmade gift around the other's wrist. And then, as if a dam had finally burst, they began to cry. Not the silent tears they'd shed alone, but the deep healing sobs of children who had finally found their way back to each other. David, who had been watching from the doorway with his mother, felt his own tears falling as his children spoke their first words in 8 months, choosing to reconnect with each other rather than with the adult world that had failed them so completely. 9 months later, the Morrison estate buzzed with the kind of chaos that only happy children could create. Emma and Ethan raced through the halls, their laughter echoing off marble floors as they played an elaborate game of tag that involved costume sound effects and rules that changed every few minutes. The friendship bracelets they'd made that transformative evening had long since worn out and been replaced by dozens of others. Their shared bedroom they'd insisted on moving back together within a week of their breakthrough looked like a textile explosion, with half-finished braiding projects covering every surface. David stood in his home office, no longer pacing in desperation, but watching through the window as Keisha taught the twins to weave friendship bracelets for their new puppy, a patient golden retriever named Hope, who wore colorful accessories with remarkable dignity. The change in his children was nothing short of miraculous. They chattered constantly now, making up for 8 months of silence with an endless stream of observations, questions, and stories. Their twin language had returned stronger than ever, peppered with new words they'd learned from Keisha and elaborate inside jokes that made perfect sense to them. But more importantly, they'd learned to be individuals within their twinness. Emma had discovered a love for gardening, spending hours in the greenhouse Keisha had helped her create. Ethan had channeled his energy into building elaborate structures with blocks and eventually graduated to helping the groundskeeper with minor construction projects around the estate. Keisha had become far more than a caregiver. She was family in every way that mattered. She'd moved into the guest house, permanently creating a cozy space filled with photos, craft supplies, and the comfortable clutter of a life fully lived. Most evenings found her in the main house sharing dinner with David and the twins, helping with homework, or curled up in the living room teaching increasingly complex braiding patterns. David had made changes too. The guilt that had nearly consumed him had transformed into purposeful action. He'd restructured his role at Morrison Tech, delegating more responsibilities and setting firm boundaries around family time. Board meetings were scheduled around school events. Business trips were planned to minimize disruption to the twins' routines. Margaret Morrison had been notably absent since the evening of the breakthrough, though she'd sent expensive gifts that the twins politely acknowledged before returning to their craft projects. She showed us that we didn't lose each other, Emma had explained to her father one evening as they worked on bracelets together. We just forgot how to find each other. But friendship bracelets help you remember. That's why they're magic. The magic David had come to understand wasn't in the bracelets themselves. It was in the simple act of creating something beautiful for someone you loved, of choosing connection over isolation, of believing that broken things could be made whole again, with patience, creativity, and enough colorful thread. In the end, Keisha's gift hadn't been her knowledge of child psychology or her experience with trauma. Her gift had been seeing Emma and Ethan not as problems to be solved, but as whole people who had temporarily lost their way back to each other. Sometimes healing was as simple as sitting down together and making something beautiful with your hands, remembering that love could be woven back together one careful knot at a time.